So the next article I want to discuss here is about, it's from Real Clear Politics. It's a commentary piece, and it's talking about how single-payer healthcare will increase fraud and corruption. I have no idea what got you to this conclusion, but okay, let's check it out. Let's see here. It says, so again, single-payer healthcare will increase fraud and corruption. This is an article from Real Clear Politics. It says, it seems fitting that the Democratic National Committee chose Miami to host the first debates of the 2020 presidential campaign. Given that many of the candidates appearing on stage have endorsed a single-payer healthcare plan, the debates' location epitomizes how government-run healthcare will lead to a massive increase in fraud and corruption. In South Florida, defrauding government healthcare programs doesn't just qualify as a cottage industry. It's big business. In 2009, 60 Minutes noted that Medicare fraud has pushed aside cocaine as the major criminal enterprise. One former fraudster admitted that likely thousands of businesses in the Miami area alone were defrauding Medicare. Eric Holder, then the Attorney General, explained why. Medicare fraud is easier and carries smaller penalties than dealing drugs. A 2009 Government Accountability Office report also highlighted pervasive fraud within Medicare. For instance, some South Florida home health agencies, quote, have submitted claims for visits that were probably not provided, such as claims for visits that allegedly occurred when hurricanes were in the area. Auditors also found that fraudsters paid off seniors to cooperate with their scams. Because some, quote, beneficiaries purportedly received more income in illegal kickbacks than from their monthly disability checks, they would not report fraud to government officials. Lest anyone believe that much has changed in the past decade, the spring of 2019 saw not $1 but $2 billion. That's $2 billion with a B. Fraud rings against Medicare exposed in a single week. On April 7th, Philip S. Formas, a South Florida businessman, was convicted for bilking Medicare and Medicaid out of $1.3 billion in fraudulent nursing home claims. 2 days later, federal authorities charged dozens more individuals in a $1.2 billion Medicare scam regarding neck braces. If you think that the single-payer bills promoted by Senators Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others would stop this rampant fraud, think again. Both the House and Senate single-payer bills include not a single new provision designed to stop crooks from defrauding government health programs. The bills would apply some existing anti-fraud provisions to the new government-run healthcare program. However, given the widespread fraud in Medicare and Medicaid, expanding the failed status quo would increase corruption rather than reducing it. To give some sense of perspective, in the last fiscal year, Medicare had a rate of improper payments either made in the wrong amount or made under fraudulent pretenses, of 8.12%. Medicaid had an even higher improper payment rate of 9.8%. Extrapolating those rates to all health spending nationwide yields estimated improper payments under a single-payer system of between $296.1 billion and $357.3 billion. These sums of potential improper payments under single-payer exceed the entire economies of countries like Finland and Denmark. If lawmakers like Bernie Sanders want to see the ways in which socialized medicine will increase fraud, they don't have far to look. Sanders' Senate colleague Robert Menendez received nearly $1 million in gifts and favors from Solomon Melgen, yet another South Florida medical provider convicting of defrauding Medicare. Yet over several years, Menendez repeatedly lobbied Medicare officials on his friend Melgen's behalf, using his influence as a senator to try to protect Melgen from his crimes. At next week's debates, moderators should should ask candidates supporting Sanders' plan whether they condone the actions of their colleague Menendez and whether they think concentrating all power in a government-run healthcare plan will increase or decrease the incidence of fraud and corruption within our healthcare system. The American people deserve better than to pay massive tax increases for this $32 trillion scheme, only to see much of that money end up in the hands of criminal fraudsters. Just a correction. The last segment, by accident, I said $32 billion, so the Medicare-for-all plan costs $32 billion, and our current system costs $48 billion. It's actually 32 trillion for Medicare for all, and 48 trillion for our current system, 48 trillion. And by the way, the organization that came up with the $32 trillion estimate is called the Mercatus Group, Mercatus Center from George Mason University. So yeah, I mean, obviously this is not a surprising article. The article by the way, is Chris Jacobs. It's the guy who wrote the article is founder and CEO of Juniper Research Group and the author of the forthcoming book, The Case Against SinglePayer. So obviously this guy is a corporate CEO somewhere, and he feels the need to just completely trash and smear SinglePayer and obviously Medicare for all, because he thinks that the fraud that is happening among Medicare and the current Medicare. So the current Medicare system, that means that any other Medicare type system or single payer system that is implemented government wide for all Americans, that somehow that's going to lead to that kind of fraud. So obviously, this is your classic case of just like typical straw man, corporatist straw manning by people that just don't want the system to change. And I mean, this guy's going out of his way to he's coming up with every possible example. Oh, something in South Florida happened where the people were being defrauded by this person and that person, and then, they were doing all these illegal things and they were screwing over people. So what they're trying to say is, look how people are getting screwed over by Medicare. Medicare is such a terrible system. We can't have this. We can't have this, existing in any other capacity than it is right now, because look how bad it is currently. Okay, buddy. So obviously you're either clueless or you're just a fraud. I would go with the latter. I think you're a fraud, and you're obviously just trying to push the narrative that that Medicare for all is terrible because I found a bunch of examples a bunch of random examples of how Medicare was defrauded and screwed over certain people. But then how about our current healthcare system? Our current healthcare system isn't screwing over anybody. Are people not being defrauded? They're not being. I mean, you could say defrauded. People are being forced to pay thousands and thousands of dollars just for cancer treatments. People are being kicked off of their healthcare plans because those health insurance companies don't want to cover them. People are not allowed to keep their doctors when they're told that they could keep their doctors. They're part of insurance plans where they're not even receiving decent care, because and then on top of the fact that they have to pay so much for that insurance, for that type of insurance, for that quality of insurance. But they're receiving poor quality insurance while paying tons of money for something that they honestly shouldn't even have to pay that much for. They're paying tons of money in co-pays and premiums and all this stuff. So how's that not defrauding the American people? How's that not defrauding people? You know, this guy's a fucking hack, bro. You're putting out these ridiculous arguments to talk about how Medicare for all is terrible, but you don't talk about how the general healthcare system the general current healthcare system in America is fucking people over. So obviously that did not cross your mind, or you're just completely ignoring that because you want to make your case about how terrible Medicare for all. I would go with the latter for sure. He wants to just talk about how terrible Medicare for all is, obviously, and he wants to completely ignore how our current healthcare system it's a fucking Ponzi scheme where everybody doesn't get decent healthcare. So this guy's just a fucking shill for the health insurance lobby. He's a shill for the healthcare companies, all the rich assholes out there, the rich CEOs and stuff that are running these, fraudulent organizations that are just screwing people over. This guy, by the way, okay, so I see now. He worked for the Federalist. The Federalist is a conservative organization that they push a lot of just your typical kind of a neoconservative, right-wing ideas. And this guy, obviously, it's no surprise that he would write a book called "The Case Against SinglePayer." I found out that he's from the Federalist. I don't know why they didn't mention it at the end of the article I read. It says, obviously at the end of the article it said who this guy is and where he works for, but it says nothing about how he's a contributor to the Federalist, which is a conservative organization. So I found that out by checking out his Twitter page. Let's see. Let's check out. I'm on Amazon.com checking out his book here. It says The Case Against Medicare. The Case Against SinglePayer. How Medicare for All will wreck America's healthcare system and its economy. Oh my God! As if the current healthcare system that we have is not fucking up our economy. As if people aren't going bankrupt from fucking medical bills. You kidding me right now? So let's just check out the synopsis here from his shitty ass book right here. It says, long thought of as an idealistic but unrealistic proposition promoted by far left activists, single payer healthcare has become a major discussion point across the political landscape. Bernie Sanders made it a central focus of his insurgent 2016 run for the Democratic presidential nomination against Hillary Clinton. House Democrats' messaging on healthcare in 2018 midterm elections, and the burgeoning campaign for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination have elevated single-payer even further, bringing the issue to the center of American politics. Surprisingly, however, few books have examined the impact of a single-payer healthcare system in depth, and most of those that have done so come from a leftist perspective supporting this dramatic change. This vacuum in the current literature cries out for a work making the case against single payer, one which educates the American people about the damaging effects of this proposed healthcare takeover, written for a broad audience ranging from interested citizens to leaders in the conservative movement. Yeah, no kidding. And says the case against single payer will explain the harmful implications of giving the federal government unfair control of the healthcare system. Wow. Well, that's just typical right-wing propaganda right there, and I guarantee you majority of centrists and people in the Democratic Party are going to read that just to make the case against single-payer and Medicare for all. And that's what shows. I mean, that's perfect example of an opportunistic hack who talks nothing about how our current healthcare system is screwing over millions and millions of people, just to talk about cherry picking a bunch of examples how Medicare is screwing over and defrauding certain people. But you don't talk about how our current healthcare system is screwing over and defrauding millions and millions and millions of people. You couldn't come up with millions and millions of examples, obviously, because you had to cherry pick a bunch of examples just to make the case for your stupid ass book and your stupid ass article here. And he's talking about Robert Menendez, who's a current senator, and he's a very corrupt, by the way, senator from New Jersey. He's involved in like a defrauding Medicare scam and shit too, and somehow that has something to do with Bernie Sanders' Medicare for all plan. It has nothing to do with it. Now, if you want to make the case that the Medicare for all bills in the Senate and the House are not focusing on the fact that fraud is occurring with those programs, that's a different story. If you want to make the case of strengthening, the defrauding schemes that are going on stuff and avoiding fraud going on within those systems, that's another story. But that doesn't mean that all of Medicare, and in at least in relation to Medicare for all is bad, and it's going to have the same effect. This guy is just making a baseless argument, and he's pushing a bunch of propaganda that he can't back it up with facts. So he's got to, like I said, he's just got to cherry pick things and come up with examples of how Medicare is terrible, and then use this as a supposed example of how everybody else is going to get screwed over, while ignoring the fact that our current our current healthcare system is fucking everybody else over, fucking up millions of people over, and not letting them get decent care. And I mean, obviously, he doesn't give a shit because he wants to sell his fucking shitty book over here, and he wants to talk about how the health insurance companies are wonderful and they have no issues and they are doing everything right. And while everybody else that's pushing for a better system that exists in other parts of the world, in industrialized countries, that system is horrible. But the system we have right now apparently is wonderful, and it shouldn't be changed at all. That's what this fucking asshole is saying. And I hope his book doesn't sell anything, and I'm sure it will, but I hope it's going to be fucking dunked on, because it's obviously pushing a ridiculous narrative. So I hope that motherfucker doesn't get a fucking dime for that stupid book.